Okay, this is a review of Chapter 9, Social Disorganization and Subcultures. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the ecological principles and the Chicago School of Sociology and how they understood their kind of early theories in criminology. We're going to look at Sean McKay's theory of social disorganization and some modern day examples of cultures and subcultures, and look at some of the criticisms of cultural theories of crime. Alright, so let's jump right in. So, it's interesting when you're looking at the Chicago School of Sociology, really they were combining different methodologies and different ways of looking at the world. So, part of this was the School of Ecology. So, basically, in a nutshell, they were interested in looking at how cities organize, how people organize, but they were doing it in a way that's kind of mirrors ecology, meaning how the plant world works, and trying to apply that to cities themselves, and how basically trying to say we can apply those ecological principles that we understand about nature to the nature of cities. So, anywho, part of understanding this is the cultural context of the time period, right? Is just understanding what was going on at that time and how that then led to the theory of social disorganization. So, experts identified the 19th century Chicago as the fastest growing city in the United States. And so, it was this that they were studying. They were studying these kind of rapid changes that had taken place, and how, because of these changes in large cities, they were happening so quickly, there weren't formal agencies or social agencies to handle some of the social problems like urban that come with urbanization. So communities were largely responsible for solving their own problems, including crime and delinquency. So by the late 1800s, Chicago was largely made up of citizens who did not speak a common language or share each other's values. So it was very difficult for citizens to organize themselves to solve the community's problems. They needed those organizations. So this resulted in the type of chaos and normlessness that Durkheim predicted would occur when urbanization and industrialization occur rapidly. There were many manifestations of the complete breakdown, but one of the most notable was children running wild on the streets and gangs with little attempts to intervene by adults in the neighborhood. So it's funny because that's kind of the characterization we hear of Chicago now, but it's nothing compared to the 1800s. So delinquency was soaring, and it appeared the gangs were controlling the streets. So the leaders and people of Chicago needed to have some theoretical guidance to develop solutions to those problems regarding the high rates of delinquency. So this is where they tapped the Chicago School of Sociology or Criminology, to try to understand what was going on, and they became very dominant in the early 1900s. Okay, so part of this, under this umbrella, is ecological principles in city growth in concentric circles. So this is Robert E. Park, and basically he's saying that much of human behavior, especially the ways that cities grow, follows the basic principles of ecology that have been documented and applied to wildlife for many years. So Park claimed that cities represent a type of complex organism that has a sense of unity, which made up the interrelations that exist among citizens and groups in the city. So instead of cells, we are people, right, in a city, instead of cells making up an organism. So he applied ecological principles of symbiosis to explain the dependency that citizens have upon each other. In addition, he claimed that all cities would contain identifiable clusters, which he called natural areas, where the cluster had taken on a life or an organic unity to itself. So many cities have neighborhoods that are made up of primarily one ethnic group or distinguished by certain features, and that's what he meant by these kind of natural areas or these identifiable clusters. So, applying several other ecological principles, Park noted that some areas or species, in the kind of more ecological sense, may invade or dominate adjacent areas or species, as well as the recession of previously dominant areas or species. So, if you know at all about, invasive species and the way that they can enter into an ecosystem and destroy it because largely there aren't predators to keep it in check, he was kind of using that same idea, but looking at it within the context of city growth. So he said that, certain areas either recede or migrate to another or die off. So in human cities, some areas invade other zones and the previously dominant area must then succeed or die off. So this is seen in modern times with the growth of what's known as urban sprawl, right? The thing where we just keep building crap because we can. We don't think about what are the kind of environmental consequences of, destroying any sort of migratory paths for birds or, other wildlife that use those areas to, bolster their populations. And of course, we get a lot of environmental ecological services from those animals doing what they do. We're part of a very complex food web, right? So anyway, basically they say that, or Park is saying that as businesses move into a traditionally stable residential area, that can be detrimental. And that invasion causes chaos due to increased traffic, more transient populations, perhaps, more crime. And so he's basically saying that, like, it starts from the center outward, right? And he was using the observed trends in Chicago to develop this theory. So he basically says, like, the inner city is the one that grows the most, and it puts pressure on the next ones, and that basically each one kind of expands outward. And you can see this in the history of things like Los Angeles, that there are things that used to be suburbs that are now just considered part of the city as the city has expanded, right? There's no real, it's very difficult to tell like where Orange County begins and Los Angeles County ends, because it's just concrete. It looks pretty much the same on either end. When in reality, it was only about a generation or so ago when there would be vast distances between these kind of areas that you could kind of tell. Same thing's going on with the IE now. If you try to look at where Orange County meets the IE, a lot of it's just freeway, a lot of it's just concrete, not big swaths of open land anymore. So basically the idea is as these things expand and become more complicated cities, they expand outward. And really, talk about the rich people expand themselves right out of the middle where all the crime and problems are. So anyway, he also talks about how these kind of constant changes within an area can cause this kind of invasion of one zone into another, and that can lead to psychological indifference towards the neighborhood, where no one really cares about protecting the community any longer, because the people that can afford to leave, and the people who can't afford to leave are just trying to save enough money so they can leave. Okay, Burgess, very similar, also talked about, concentric circles and city growth, but he was the one that kind of came up with the specific zones and how they radiate into each other. So Burgess basically said that, again, cities are not simply growing on the edges. They're growing from the middle outward, and that the source of growth begins in the center of the city, because that's where a lot of the industry was, right? And I say was because, this is a theory developed in what was going on in Chicago at that time period. And now we know because of deindustrialization, a lot of those inner city zones that, where a lot of manufacturing and other kind of businesses were located, a lot of that has been offshored. Meaning we've taken all these industries and we've moved them to another country so that corporations can pay people pennies for the same thing they would pay people $20, $30, $40 an hour to do here, so they can make more corporate profits, right? So anyway, we'll talk about that later. But basically, just get the theory down first, then we'll talk about how it's changed. Okay, so Burgess basically looked at these primary zones that all cities appear to have, which included 5 pseudo-distinctive natural areas that were constantly in a state of flux. So basically you have Zone 1. This is the central business district. This area of the city contains the largest business buildings, the skyscrapers, banking, chambers of commerce, courthouses, essential business political centers like police headquarters, post offices, etc. So again, I think the best example of this, I don't know. I'm not as familiar with Chicago as I am with Los Angeles, so I feel like Los Angeles is a great example of this. Maybe Chicago is too. I wouldn't know. But anyway, basically, the central business district, if you think about downtown LA, right? There's that kind of big chunk of where all that stuff is. The banks, the skyscrapers, all that fun stuff, the, courthouses, the police headquarters, all that fun stuff. Then, in that kind of adjacent, right outside the business district, is what's called the factory zone. And this is perhaps the most significant in terms of causing crime, because this is the one that invades previously stable zones, or what was considered zone 2. So this is kind of that like place where there's just like lots of like warehouses or just kind of empty lots or things like that. And think about it, why would that create more crime? Well, because again, it's the kind of in transition part of it where there's no kind of steward or gatekeeper to make sure that like things are going as they should. Also, you get more of a transient population in areas where there isn't like stable housing. And, think about it. Who has stewardship or ownership over those spaces when it's just a bunch of like warehouses and kind of empty lots and things like that? People aren't going to feel like connected to that as their social space. So anyway, zone 2 is the zone in transition. This is the one right around that's transitioning from residential to industrial. So this used to be where people lived to work in those inner city areas, but now it expands outward and outward. So zone 2 is the area that's most significantly subjected to ecological principles suggested by Park, namely invasion, domination, recession, and secession. So this is the zone that subsequent theorists focused on in criminological theorizing, because this is where a lot of the transitions are taking place, which means where it's a lot of the instability, and the instability leads to that crime. So zone 3, right around it. So imagine just kind of circles that radiate outward, like if you throw a rock into a pond, right? So zone 3 around that is what they call the working men's homes. Again, men's, reflection of the time period. Anyway, women always worked. It's just this weird myth that we think that women only worked after World War II. But poor women, women of color, immigrant women, they were always working. Yes, women did enter the workforce in mass after World War II, side note, but largely the real focus of women entering the workforce in World War II was that women were entering male-dominated positions. That they said, women can't do that job. They're not strong enough to be a riveter. And then you have like Rosie the Riveter. And then after that, it was very difficult to say, hey, women can't do these jobs because they just did them for a year and a half. So they can't say like, oh, you're not capable of it. So that's kind of where the cat got let out of the bag. But anyway, long story short, that was totally side note. Working men's homes is zone 3. This is basically modest homes and apartments. Like think of like, working class dwellings, not super fancy areas, but pretty close to work. Zone 4 around that is higher priced family dwellings, more expensive apartments. So, again, kind of as you get outward from the center, you get to more wealthy areas that are farther away from those kind of crime issues in zone 2. So, zone 4 is that. And then once you get to zone 5, this is considered the suburban or commuter zone. This is like people live in big ass houses with big old backyards and lots of space. But they got to drive now farther to get to that area where the work is. So the 3 outer zones are less important in terms of distinction, primarily because, the farther a family can get away from the city, the better in terms of social organization and the lower the rate of social ills, meaning delinquency or poverty that they're going to experience. So the important point of this theory of concentric circles is that growth of each inner zone puts pressure on the next one to grow and push into the adjacent zone. All right, moving on to Sean McKay's theory of social disorganization, again known as the Chicago School of Criminology they were coming from. They proposed a framework that begins with the assumption that certain neighborhoods in all cities have more crime than other parts of the city. And most of them are located in zone 2. That's the zone in transition from residential to industrial because of the invasion of factories. Again, we're not being invaded by factories anymore. Long story, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so according to Sean McKay, the neighborhoods that have the highest rates of crime typically have at least 3 common problems in the area. Physical dilapidation, right? So just crap's falling over. Poverty. And heterogeneity. Ooh. Now, what do they mean by heterogeneity? They mean a high cultural mix. And what do they mean by that? They mean racial and ethnic mix. So there were other common characteristics to these neighborhoods, such as high transient populations, aka the unhoused, right? As well as unemployment among the residents of the neighborhood. So it's predicted that the antecedent factors of poverty, heterogeneity, ooh, and physical dilapidation leads to a state of social disorganization, which then leads to crime and delinquency. So, one of the most significant contributions of Sean McKay's model is that they demonstrated that the prevalence and frequency of various social ills, be it poverty, disease, maybe things that are like health related, like low birth weights, they tend to overlap with higher rates of delinquency. So, regardless of what social problem is being measured, higher rates of social problems are almost always clustered in the zone in transition. So in the zone in transition, Sean McKay believed there was a breakdown in informal social controls that children began to learn offending norms from their interaction with peers on the street through what they called play activities. So the breakdown in conditions of the neighborhood leads to social disorganization, which then leads to delinquents learning criminal activities from older youth in the neighborhood. So one of the best things about Sean McKay's theoretical model is they supply data to actually support their propositions. That's a big one in research. We love when there's actual research that can document and show what they're talking about instead of just theorizing. So they demonstrated through data from the U.S. Census and city records that neighborhoods that had high rates of poverty, physical dilapidation, and high cultural mix were the neighborhoods that had the highest rates of delinquency and crime. And so other, high rates of delinquency and other social problems were consistent with Burgess's framework of concentric circles as well. So, but there was an exception to the model. There were, ones that didn't kind of fit. So for instance, the Gold Coast area along the northern coast of Lake Michigan was completely off the mark as far as high rates of social problems, particularly delinquency. So clearly there could be like a cultural issue there. Also, Sean McKay's longitudinal data showed it doesn't matter what ethnic group lives in Zone 2, because all of those groups that lived in Zone 2 had higher delinquency rates while they lived in that area. So that it's not really about the ethnicity, it's about living in Zone 2. With the exception of Asian Americans, which was actually the one kind of caveat to what they found. Once most of each ethnic group moved out of Zone 2, their delinquency rates would decrease significantly. So there's something about the zone itself. So this finding rejects the notion of social Darwinism because it's obvious that it's not the culture that influences crime and delinquency, but really the criminogenic nature of the environment that someone's in. Okay, so let's move on to cultural and subcultural theories of crime. So these theories of crime assume that there are unique groups in society that socialize their children to believe that certain activities that violate conventional law are good and positive ways to behave. So you have, some of these early developments is, in cultural theory has really been attributed to the 1967 work of Ferracuti and Wolfgang, who examined the violent themes of a group of inner city youth from Philadelphia. Their primary conclusion was that violence is a culturally learned adaptation to deal with negative life circumstances. So learning such norms occurs in an environment that emphasizes violence over other options. But Ferracuti and Wang were clear that their theory was based on subcultural norms. Specifically, they proposed that no subculture can be totally different or totally in conflict with the society in which they're a part of. The distinction between a culture and a subculture is that a culture represents a distinct separate set of norms and values among an identifiable group that are similarly different from that of the dominant culture, right? So that subculture, they have their own values, they have their own kind of ways of life or things, but that means they still fit within the larger context. It's really when you get to be a counterculture, that's the difference. So subcultures and countercultures are a little bit different. We'll talk about that later as well, but a subculture is often just a culture within the culture, right? But it can have distinct values and norms. So let's use a non-crime example. Let's say skateboarding is a subculture, right? It's a people who can look at the urban environment and see opportunities to land tricks and skate instead of seeing it as like, I don't know, a place to sit down or a nice rail, right, to hold on to when you walk down a flight of stairs. So they're not necessarily like taking down society, but they are a group within society that lives a little bit differently, that has a little bit of different values than the dominant group, right? Or another subculture you could say would be something like veganism, right? A group of people that reject the societal norm of eating meat with every meal, people who are aware of what their food system is and where their food comes from and the environmental impacts of what they eat, and decide, no, they don't want to support an industry that tortures animals and creates global warming and, unnecessarily murders millions of animals just so that people can, like, sit in their cultural idea that every day meat pops up on the plate without actually having to go hunt it, kill it, skin it, drain its blood, chop it up into chunks, and then cook it. Right? All of that stuff is sanitized for us by the whole industry. You just walk into a store and grab a pound of ground beef. You don't think about how it got there. Right? So, a subculture like vegans do think about those things and the environmental impacts that they make with their choices. So they just don't engage with that stuff, right? So again, did they overthrow society? Have they changed the way that everyone else does it? No. But a subculture is identifiable, right? And different in some way from the dominant culture. Okay. Whew, sorry. Okay, Walter Miller is another one here. He presented a theoretical model that proposes that the entire lower class has its own cultural value system. So in this model, virtually everyone that's poor believed in and is socialized in the values of the 6 focal concerns. So he says that, okay, here's the 6. I'll say what they are and then I'll explain them. So the 6 are fate, autonomy, trouble, toughness, excitement, and smartness. So fate means this is the idea that, what kind of opportunities you have in life shapes what you see for your life, right? So if you were born an heiress, right, you're like your daddy's a billionaire and you just like were born with more money than God, then like you pretty much have any potential future path open to you that you want. But think about if you're born into endemic poverty, into generational poverty, where people have been struggling for years, especially when you add in the racial animus or, just the inequality and the unfair treatment that comes with racial bias, or, ethnic bias or immigrant bias or any of these other kind of things. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. You're living in a marginalized situation. Fate is going to become much more controlling of your life, meaning this is kind of the idea that you're just stuck with the life you were dealt, right? You're dealt a hand and, basically it kind of in a way disregards your responsibility for your own actions because you feel like, well, I'm just stuck here. I have no opportunity. It's just fate. Autonomy also is important. This is the value of independence from authority, right? When you have very little power in society, when people are able to control and denigrate you, having some autonomy from authority, having some way to push back is important. Trouble is another focal concern. This is the concern of staying out of legal problems, as well as getting into and out of personal difficulties. Okay, toughness kind of speaks for itself as a focal concern. That's just maintaining your reputation on the street. Why is that important? Well, because the tougher you seem and the more you seem like someone not to mess with, let's just say, then the less likely someone will mess with you or step to you in any way. And that means that your likelihood of actually experiencing violence or, somehow losing out on that kind of campaigning for respect is not going to happen. So the tougher you are, the less likely anyone messes with you, which keeps your toughness up there, right? So that's a big one. Excitement's another one. So this could be engagement of activities that help liven otherwise mundane experience of being lower class, right? So not having a lot going on just because you don't have the kind of money and resources to have fun in more conventional ways that are considered appropriate. So this can be sometimes activities that are just, somewhat delinquent or maybe even illegal because they're fun. Right? And then last one is smartness, an emphasis on street smarts. Basically the ability to protect yourself on the street, but also the ability to kind of con others that aren't as street smart as yourself, right? To give you a little bit more of a head up or a little advantage over those people in that same space. So Miller claimed that these 6 focal concerns were emphasized and taught by members of the lower class as a culture or environment, or as he calls it, a milieu, right? All right, and then Elijah Anderson, Code of the Street, love this man. I actually used to assign Code of the Street for this class and make you read the whole damn thing. I don't anymore because I don't know. I don't know. Maybe the pandemic gave me a heart. I don't know what it is. But anyway, I figured the two books was enough. So, what's really impactful about his book, it's an ethnography. It's really powerful. It talks about basically he moves into this area of inner city Philadelphia. And he tries to basically talk to people. He lives there for years, as you do with an ethnography, to kind of better understand the neighborhood dimensions, what's going on there, who lives there, all that kind of fun stuff. And so in his book, he focuses on African Americans and claims that due to very deprived conditions in the inner cities, the Black Americans feel a sense of hopelessness, a lot of isolation from the larger, American society, and as a result, a lot of despair. So, Elijah Anderson notes that while many African Americans believe in middle class values, these values have no value on the street, particularly among young males. So, what's interesting in his book, he talks about how the neighborhood compositions aren't what people think, especially aren't what police think. What he found in his own research is that about 80% of the population are people who are just working their jobs, working class folks, trying to get ahead, trying to save money, trying to protect their children. And then about 20% of the neighborhood was more criminal element, right? Street gangs, youth toughs, that kind of stuff. And what's interesting about that dynamic is the 20% is so visible, right? These are people sitting out on their stoop. These are people having open air drug markets, just kind of visible for people to see. Versus you don't see the kid behind, in the house with the barred windows doing their homework, studying really hard so they can go to college on a scholarship, right? Like you don't see all those people that, and actually a whole nother element of it too is that we talk about a lot of, by kind of criminalizing the youth within these spaces, we talk a lot about, oh, they're committing crimes, they're victimizing people, but what we don't mention is the people in those neighborhoods are the ones most likely to be victimized. So that 80% of folks living in that neighborhood are also the ones we should really care about how they're being victimized. But instead, often we look at crime geographically and just say, well, this poor area has more crime, therefore everyone in it is suspect as a criminal, even though the majority of the people living in the neighborhood want that crime to go away too. But because of poor police response times, lack of community policing, they call the cops and they don't show up. And also, if the cops say, hey, yeah, your neighbor 2 doors down called about you, in the book, he gives various examples of how that can be a problem. Like even a silly one, like he talked about how these kids were like, yeah, they told these other kids, sure, you can borrow our baseball gloves and bats to play baseball because not everyone has the equipment necessary, right? And then when the mom tried to go to meet with the other mom to get that stuff back, she tried to not give it back to her, right? Which goes against middle class values. So then the mother finally gets that stuff back and she goes back home where her daughter had been bullied. And her daughter, for years, people were telling her, stand up for yourself, stand up to the bully, stand up for yourself. That's the only thing that's going to work. So she did stand up to her bully, one-on-one, and beat her. And then the bully showed up to her house with 20 people to beat her ass. So her mom just happened to come home with the baseball bat right about that time period, fortuitously, and had to use the baseball bat to try and keep 20 angry, young adults from beating the crap out of her daughter. So that's one example of just the kind of vignettes of people's personal experiences that he weaves into a theoretical analysis in that book. Highly recommend Code of the Streets. It's only it retails for $10. Great book. Yeah, I don't force you to read it anymore, but you should read it anyway. Okay, so some of the policy implications that come from these theoretical models, some of them are kind of rather ironic. So neighborhoods that are most desperately in need of becoming organized to fight crime are the same ones that are the most difficult to cultivate organizations in. Like trying to get neighborhood watch or a block watch going with your neighbors that are, drug dealers is going to be difficult. Although there are some anecdotal examples of success within neighborhood watch programs, all the empirical evidence shows that the approach is almost uniformly unsupportive of its ability to reduce crime in neighborhoods. So we think neighborhood watch makes sense. We all look out for each other, neighborhood watch. But in reality, many of the studies show that, it doesn't actually reduce the levels of crime. It actually increases the fear of crime, perhaps due to the heightened awareness regarding crime in their area. Perhaps the most notable program that resulted from the Chicago School of Social Disorganization model is the Chicago Area Project, or CAP, which is, and similar programs have also done this as well, but it was a failure in reducing crime rates among its participants, and largely, again, because the assumption here is that when you create these kind of programs, it's going to, help create community, which then helps control crime, but there just wasn't any empirical support for that. And then regarding cultural, subcultural programs, there have been some promising interventions and outreach programs that have been suggested by these kind of models of offending. So there's now a lot of programs that attempt to build pro-social attitudes among other kind of aspects among high-risk youth, often young children. So one example is a recent program called Peace Builders, which focuses on children in early grades. And this is shown to be effective in producing gains in conflict resolution, development of pro-social values, and reductions in aggression. And a follow-up study showed that these attributes were maintained for a long period of time. So that's very promising to say if we teach kids from a young age how to deal with their conflicts, how to, minimize conflict and problem solve and come to conflict resolutions and have pro-social values about why we should, support society, things like that, that building that into kids at a young age can have lasting impacts on their adult development. So that's a really interesting kind of finding coming from this perspective.